"Oh my God, you're so clumsy. This is exactly why your kind doesn't belong here." A proud middle-aged woman shouted aggressively at the black woman, Simone Richardson, in an elegant dress at the gala night. The words hung in the air like poison. The room erupted into cruel laughter. Wealthy guests in designer gowns and $1,000 suits pointed their phones at the scene, capturing what they thought would be the night's entertainment. The middle-aged woman with perfectly styled silver hair shrieked across the marble foyer, her voice dripping with disgust. "You're nothing, you hear me? Nothing. You don't deserve to breathe the same air as decent people here. Security, get this disaster out before she breaks something valuable. People like her always cause trouble." Before anyone could react, the black woman was pushed to the floor with wine all over her. But as Simone slowly began to rise, something shifted in the atmosphere. Wine dripped from her dress onto the marble, each drop echoing in what was becoming an ominous silence. Her phone was clutched in her hand, and there was something in her eyes, something that should have terrified everyone in that room. Cold determination. The silver-haired woman wasn't finished. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper that still carried across the now quieting room. "You're wretched, you're worthless, and you will never be anything more than what you are right now. Nothing." The woman on the floor stood up completely now, straightening her stained dress with dignity that seemed impossible given what had just happened to her. She looked around the room at all the faces staring at her, some laughing, some recording, all of them convinced they were witnessing the humiliation of someone who didn't matter. They had no idea what was coming, and they were about to find out who she really was. She reached for her phone, and in that moment, you could almost feel the universe holding its breath. Because what this woman was about to do would not only shock everyone in that room, it would destroy them completely. If you believe everyone should be treated with respect no matter who they are, hit that subscribe button right now, type respect, and tell us where you're watching from, because what happens next will blow your mind. This family has no idea who they just messed with. This was Simone Richardson's breaking point. But to understand how devastating her response would be, you need to know who Simone really was. And trust me, the Whitmore family was about to get the most expensive education of their lives. Simone Richardson wasn't just any woman who had wandered into this party. At 45 years old, she was one of the most powerful CEOs in America, worth over $57 billion. But her journey to the top had been anything but easy. Over the last 2 decades, she built Richardson Global Industries from nothing into an empire spanning real estate, technology, and manufacturing. She owned buildings in every major city, had partnerships with Fortune 500 companies worldwide, and employed over 100,000 people. But she never forgot where she came from. And she never forgot her grandma, who sacrificed everything to get her there. Now let's talk about the family that had just humiliated her, the Whitmores. On the surface, they represented everything that old money America was supposed to be. But underneath their polished exterior, they were drowning. Charles Whitmore, at 62, had inherited his father's real estate empire and had spent decades trying to prove he was worthy of the family name. But poor decisions, failed investments, and a changing market had slowly eaten away at the foundation his ancestors had built. What nobody knew, not his wife, not his children, not even his closest advisors, was that Whitmore Industries was secretly bankrupt. The company that had once owned half of Manhattan was now leveraged to the breaking point. Charles had been hiding the truth for months, moving money around, taking out secret loans, and desperately searching for a solution that would save not just his business, but his family's entire legacy. His wife Margaret, 58 years old, lived in a bubble of social superiority that she protected more fiercely than anything else in her life. She had built her entire identity around being better than everyone else, around being part of Manhattan's elite social circle. The thought of losing her status, her position, her ability to look down on others, it terrified her more than financial ruin. Margaret spent her days organizing charity events, not out of genuine compassion, but because it allowed her to control who was in and who was out. She wielded social exclusion like a weapon, and she took genuine pleasure in making others feel small and unwelcome. Their son Brandon, 28 years old, was a walking disaster, wrapped in expensive clothes. He had never worked a real day in his life, had failed at every business venture his father had bought for him, and spent his time partying with other rich kids who were equally useless. Brandon lived off his family's money while contributing absolutely nothing, and he had developed a cruel streak that he used to make himself feel superior to others. Their daughter Sophia, 26, was perhaps the most dangerous of them all. Beautiful, charming, and completely ruthless, she had learned from her mother that cruelty could be an art form. Sophia took genuine pleasure in humiliating others, especially those she perceived as beneath her social status. She was Daddy's princess, spoiled beyond belief, and she had never faced real consequences for her actions. But here's what none of them knew as they stood in their penthouse that night, laughing at the woman they had just humiliated. Simone Richardson held their entire future in her hands. The charity gala they were hosting wasn't just any party. It was supposed to be a celebration of the biggest business deal in Whitmore history. A $1.2 billion merger with Richardson Global Industries that would not only save Charles's company, but make the Whitmore family richer than they had ever been. Charles had been negotiating this deal for months, and it was supposed to be announced that very evening. The merger would bring in enough cash to pay off all of Whitmore Industries' hidden debts, fund new projects for the next decade, and secure the family's legacy for generations to come. But the woman they had just called worthless, wretched, and nothing, she was Simone Richardson, the CEO and founder of Richardson Global Industries. The very woman who was supposed to sign papers that would save their empire was lying on their floor, covered in wine, having been racially humiliated by the very family whose future depended on her generosity. And the most ironic part? Charles had no idea what Simone looked like. All their negotiations had been handled through lawyers and intermediaries. He had never seen a photo, never met her in person. In his mind, he probably pictured some old white businessman in a suit. The Whitmores had just committed the most expensive mistake in business history, and they didn't even know it yet. But the nightmare for Simone Richardson didn't begin when she hit that marble floor. It started hours earlier, the moment she stepped out of her private car and approached the very building she actually owned. It was 6 p.m. on a crisp October evening in Manhattan. Simone had arrived at the Fifth Avenue penthouse, looking absolutely stunning. She wore an elegant but simple evening gown that had cost more than most people's cars, a custom piece from a designer whose waiting list was 2 years long. Her hair was styled to perfection, her jewelry was understated but expensive, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in any room she entered. This was supposed to be her night. The night she would finally meet the Whitmore family face to face and celebrate their historic business partnership. She'd been looking forward to this evening for weeks, imagining how pleasant it would be to finally put faces to the names she'd been negotiating with for months. But the moment she stepped toward the entrance, reality hit her like a slap in the face. A valet rushed over, not to help her, but to redirect her. Without even looking at her properly, he pointed toward the back of the building with a dismissive wave. "Ma'am, service entrance is around back," he said, his tone making it clear that he thought her presence at the front entrance was some kind of mistake. Simone paused, taken aback. "I'm sorry, but I'm here for the charity gala." The valet looked her up and down, his confusion obvious. It was as if the very idea of her attending such an event was impossible for his brain to process. He reluctantly pointed her toward the main entrance, but his expression said everything. He was certain she was making some kind of error. At the main entrance, a security guard named Jake stood behind a podium, checking invitations. Simone watched the process for a few minutes, and what she saw should have prepared her for what was coming. Guest after guest approached Jake, all of them white, all of them in expensive clothes. A quick glance at their invitation, a warm smile, maybe a brief, "Good evening, enjoy the party," and they walked right in. No questions, no verification, no hassle. A white woman in a fur coat approached with her invitation barely visible in her purse. Jake nodded and waved her through without even asking to see it properly. A white man in a tuxedo walked up while talking loudly on his phone, flashed something that might have been an invitation, and Jake practically opened the door for him personally. When Simone's turn came, everything changed. Jake took her invitation and immediately his demeanor shifted. Gone was the warm smile he'd given the previous guests. His face became serious, suspicious, as if she'd just handed him evidence of a crime. He studied the invitation like a detective examining a ransom note. He checked his guest list once, then twice, then a third time, running his fingers slowly down the names. "I don't see any Richardson on here," he announced, loud enough for other arriving guests to hear. "Could you check again, please?" Simone asked politely, maintaining her composure. "I'm definitely expected." Jake made an elaborate show of looking at his list again, squinting at it as if the names might magically change. He shook his head slowly. "Nope. No Richardson anywhere." Behind Simone, a white couple approached with their invitation. Jake barely glanced at it before waving them through with his biggest smile of the night. "Have a wonderful evening," he called after them cheerfully. Simone watched this happen and felt her stomach sink. "But I have the invitation right there," she pointed out, trying to keep her voice level. Jake held up her elegant invitation, the same type of invitation that had gotten dozens of other guests inside without question, and shook his head dismissively. "Ma'am, anyone can fake these things nowadays. They print them at Kinko's, make them look all official. We have to be careful." As he said this, another guest walked past them with an invitation that was clearly printed on regular paper, not even the expensive cardstock that Simone's was made from. Jake waved him through without a second glance. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Jake told Simone, his hand extended expectantly. She handed over her driver's license, a legitimate New York State ID with all the proper security features. Jake took it and began examining it with the intensity of a forensic expert. He held it up to the light. He compared the photo to her face multiple times. He ran his finger over the surface as if checking for irregularities. He even took out a small flashlight and shined it on various parts of the license. "This doesn't look real to me," he announced loudly, making sure nearby guests could hear him. "The picture doesn't even look like you." The picture looked exactly like her. It was a professional photo taken just 6 months earlier at the DMV, clear and undeniably her face. But Jake wasn't really examining the photo. He was looking for any excuse, any reason to deny her entry. "I assure you, it's completely legitimate," Simone said, her patience beginning to wear thin. "We're going to need to verify this with management," Jake declared, stepping away with both her ID and her invitation. "You'll have to wait out here while we check." And so began the longest 2 hours of Simone Richardson's adult life. She stood outside in the cold October evening, watching as hundreds of guests entered the building without any problems whatsoever. The temperature was dropping, and her elegant gown provided little warmth against the autumn chill. She watched couples laugh and chat as they walked past her, heading into the warmth and luxury of the penthouse above. She saw businessmen she recognized from magazine covers, celebrities she'd met at other charity events, and socialites whose donations she had personally matched through her foundation. None of them had been asked for ID. None of them had been told to wait. None of them had been treated like a potential criminal trying to sneak into a place they didn't belong. Every 20 minutes or so, Jake would reappear with an update that was really no update at all. "Still checking with management," he'd say with fake apologetic tone. "Shouldn't be much longer." But through the glass doors, Simone could see Jake clearly. He wasn't making any calls, He wasn't talking to any managers. He was just standing around, occasionally chatting with other staff members, sometimes laughing with the other security guards. He wasn't verifying anything. He was deliberately stalling, hoping she would get frustrated and leave. As she waited, Simone watched the social dynamic playing out around her. Other guests who arrived late were waved through immediately. A group of young people, who were obviously drunk, were welcomed with open arms. A woman who had clearly lost her invitation was allowed in just because Jake recognized her from previous events. But Simone remained outside, shivering in her expensive gown, being treated like an unwelcome intruder. At one point, a woman in a mink coat walked past her and actually stepped away, as if being near Simone might somehow contaminate her. Another guest stared at her openly, whispering to his companion about how some people just don't know their place. By the time Jake finally returned with her documents and a grudging admission that she could enter, 2 full hours had passed. Simone had missed the cocktail hour, the networking time, the dinner service, and most of the evening's program. She was being allowed into what was supposed to be her celebration after it was nearly over. Her feet were numb from standing in heels on the cold pavement. Her carefully styled hair had been messed up by the wind. And her excitement about the evening had been replaced by a growing sense of dread about what else might be waiting for her inside. But she had no idea that the real humiliation was just beginning. The moment Simone stepped into the marble foyer of the penthouse she actually owned through one of her real estate companies, Margaret Whitmore spotted her from across the room. Margaret's reaction was immediate and loud enough for half the party to hear. "Oh my God, how did the cleaning lady get past security?" The words cut through the elegant cocktail party chatter like a knife. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. All eyes focused on Simone, standing in the doorway. Charles Whitmore, who had been in the middle of telling a story to a group of investors, stopped mid-sentence and turned to see what his wife was shrieking about. When he saw Simone, his voice boomed across the entire penthouse. "This is a private event, not a job fair. Security." Brandon Whitmore, who was already 3 drinks past tipsy, thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever witnessed. He raised his champagne glass and shouted to his circle of equally drunk friends, "Did someone order maid service? Because I think our bathrooms could use some attention." His friends erupted in laughter, clinking their glasses together as if they'd just heard the most clever joke in the world. Sophia Whitmore, who had been posing for photos with other socialites, giggled from across the room, her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes from someone who has never faced real consequences. "She's probably looking for the broom closet. Someone should point her in the right direction." More laughter rippled through the crowd. People were pulling out their phones, some to record, others to text their friends about the entertainment that had just walked in. Simone tried to speak up, to explain who she was and why she was there. She had practiced this moment, imagining how she would introduce herself to the Whitmore family. "Actually, I'm here for..." But Margaret Whitmore cut her off immediately, stepping closer with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in her entire privileged life. "Sweetheart," she said with a smile that was pure venom, "you're nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing. This isn't your world, and it never will be." Margaret's voice grew louder, more theatrical, as she realized she had an audience. "You're wretched and pathetic, and you don't deserve to breathe the same air as decent people like us." Charles nodded approvingly at his wife's words, shaking his head in apparent disgust. "Security completely failed us tonight. How do people like this keep getting into places where they clearly don't belong?" Other guests began to gather around, forming a loose circle like spectators at some kind of bizarre show. They whispered among themselves, pointing and staring at Simone as if she were some fascinating but inferior species on display. "Look at her trying to act sophisticated," one woman whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The nerve of some people," another guest added, shaking his head in mock concern. when Simone, who hadn't eaten or drunk anything in hours, tried to approach the bar to get a simple glass of water. The bartender immediately looked toward Margaret for guidance. Margaret's response was swift and cruel. She shook her head violently and called out loud enough for the entire room to hear, "No drinks for the help. She doesn't deserve even water from our glasses." Brandon found this absolutely hilarious. He stumbled over, swaying slightly from the alcohol, and pointed at Simone with his champagne flute. "If you want to feel useful tonight," he slurred with a grin, "why don't you go help the real staff serve real people? At least then, you'd be doing something you're actually qualified for." Sophia clapped her hands together in delight, as if Brandon had just said something brilliant. Yes, finally something she might actually be good at. The crowd laughed and applauded, treating Brandon's cruelty like it was stand-up comedy. When Simone tried to find somewhere to sit and collect herself, her feet were still aching from standing outside for 2 hours. Margaret blocked her path like a bouncer. "Those chairs are for guests," she said with obvious disgust, looking Simone up and down like she was something dirty. "Not for whatever you are." So Simone was forced to stand in a corner of the room while the entire party mocked her. She became their evening's entertainment, the object of their cruel amusement. Guests would walk by and make comments just loud enough for her to hear. "Look how she's trying to act like she belongs here." The audacity is truly breathtaking. Someone should call social services and report this. I can't believe security let this happen. For over an hour, Simone endured this systematic humiliation. She stood in that corner, being degraded and dehumanized by people who had no idea they were destroying their own future with every cruel word. She watched as these people she had been prepared to go into business with, people she had been ready to make incredibly wealthy, revealed their true character. She saw their cruelty, their casual racism, their complete lack of basic human decency. And through it all, she maintained her composure. She didn't fight back. She didn't argue. She didn't storm out. She simply stood there and watched these people show her exactly who they really were. Finally, she pulled out her phone to check on something. The merger documents that were supposed to be signed that very evening. The documents that would inject $1.2 billion into the Whitmore family's failing empire and save them from the bankruptcy that none of their guests knew was looming. That's when Sophia Whitmore decided it was time to deliver the final devastating blow. She approached Simone with a full glass of red wine, her face carefully arranged in an expression of fake sympathy that would have won her an Academy Award. "I feel so bad for you," she said in a voice that carried just far enough for nearby guests to hear her apparent kindness. "You look so thirsty. Here, let me get you something to drink." Simone looked up, genuinely surprised by what seemed like the first act of basic human kindness she'd received all evening. After hours of degradation, someone was finally offering her something to drink. She reached out gratefully for the glass, thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was one decent person in this family. But as her hand extended toward the wine glass, Sophia deliberately stuck out her leg, positioning it perfectly in Simone's path. Simone tripped over Sophia's deliberately placed leg and crashed hard onto the marble floor. Her elegant dress spread around her like spilled paint, and she hit the ground with enough force to bruise her knees and palms. In the exact same instant, Sophia accidentally dumped the entire glass of red wine all over Simone's white gown, creating a stain that looked like a crime scene. Sophia immediately launched into an Oscar-worthy performance, gasping and covering her mouth in mock horror, her eyes wide with fake shock. "Oh my God, you're so clumsy. I'm so sorry. I was just trying to help." Margaret rushed over, her voice filled with righteous indignation, as if Simone had deliberately caused this scene just to ruin their party. "This is exactly what happens when people forget their place. Look what you've done to our floors." Brandon was already recording everything on his phone, laughing so hard he could barely hold the device steady. "This is definitely going viral. Someone call housekeeping." "Oh wait, She is housekeeping. The entire room erupted in the cruelest laughter Simone had ever heard. Phones came out from every direction. Social media posts were being typed in real time. Videos were being uploaded. This was their entertainment for the evening. The complete humiliation of another human being. Charles waved frantically toward the security guards who had finally appeared. Get this walking disaster out of here before she destroys something actually valuable. And that's when we reached the moment where this story began, with Simone Richardson lying on the marble floor of a penthouse she owned, covered in wine, surrounded by the laughter of people who had just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. They had no idea that the woman they were humiliating held their entire future in her hands. They had no idea that she was worth more than their entire social circle combined. They had no idea that she owned the building they were standing in, the companies they worked for, and the future they thought was secure. But they were about to find out, and it was going to cost them everything. What would you do if someone did this to you like this? Would you walk away, or would you fight back? Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit the subscribe button, because this woman's next move is about to cost this white family everything they've ever built. What happened next was the moment that would haunt the Whitmore family for the rest of their lives. Simone Richardson began to rise from that marble floor slowly, deliberately, like a queen reclaiming her throne. Red wine dripped from her stained white gown onto the pristine marble beneath her, each drop echoing in what should have been a warning to everyone watching. But they were still laughing. The entire room was still caught up in their cruel entertainment, phones still recording, guests still making jokes at her expense. They thought this was the end of the show, the moment when the cleaning lady would finally be escorted out and their evening could return to normal. They had no idea that the real show was just beginning. As Simone stood there, wine-stained and humiliated, her phone began to ring. The sound cut through the laughter like a blade, but the crowd was too busy celebrating their cruelty to pay attention. Simone looked at the caller ID and answered with an eerie calm that should have sent chills down everyone's spine. Richardson Global, Simone speaking. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and loud enough for the guests closest to her to hear, if they had been listening. Miss Richardson, this is James from Legal. The Whitmore contracts are ready for your signature. Should I bring them to the gala for the announcement tonight? But the room was still too busy laughing and mocking to notice what was happening right in front of them. Brandon was showing his friends the video he'd recorded, replaying Simone's fall over and over again. Sophia was posing for selfies with the wine stain visible in the background. Margaret was describing the incident to late arriving guests, embellishing the story to make it even more humiliating. Simone's voice remained perfectly calm, but there was something in her tone, a coldness that would have frozen the blood of anyone smart enough to listen. Cancel everything, James, every single contract. James's voice carried a note of confusion. I'm sorry, Miss Richardson. Could you repeat that? Cancel what exactly? The entire $1.2 billion merger. The real estate deals, the technology partnerships, all of it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Miss Richardson, are you certain? The entire Whitmore deal? Simone looked around the room at the faces of people who had spent the evening destroying her dignity, and her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a scream. Burn it all down, James. A few guests who were standing closest to her had stopped laughing. Something in her tone, something about the words billion and merger had caught their attention. They were starting to listen, starting to look at her differently. But Margaret Whitmore was still completely oblivious. She was holding court near the bar, regaling a group of socialites with her version of the evening's events. Look at her over there, pretending to be important, Margaret laughed, gesturing toward Simone with her champagne glass. She's probably calling her drug dealer or her probation officer. The group around Margaret erupted in fresh laughter, but it was nervous laughter now. Something had shifted in the room, though most people couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. Charles Whitmore had been in the middle of a conversation with potential investors when fragments of Simone's phone call reached his ears. The words, merger and billion, cut through the cocktail party chatter like alarm bells. His face went completely white. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly that the man he'd been talking to asked if he was feeling all right. Charles pushed through the crowd, moving toward Simone with growing panic in his eyes. When he was close enough to see her clearly, close enough to hear her conversation, he interrupted with a voice that cracked with desperation. "Excuse me. What did you say your name was again?" Simone ended her call and turned to face the man who had called her a walking disaster just minutes earlier. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly calm, perfectly professional, and perfectly devastating. Simone Richardson, CEO and founder of Richardson Global Industries. She reached into her purse and pulled out a platinum business card, the kind that costs more to produce than most people make in a day. She handed it to Charles with the same calm dignity she might use to greet a head of state. Charles took the card with trembling fingers and read it. As the words sank in, his wine glass slipped from his other hand and crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces, just like his empire was about to. The sound of breaking glass cut through the room like a gunshot. Conversations stopped, heads turned. Everyone was looking at Charles, wondering why the host of the party had just gone completely pale and dropped his drink. Margaret noticed the commotion and rushed over, still completely clueless about what was happening. "Charles, what's wrong? Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" "It's just the cleaning woman." Charles couldn't speak. He just stared at the business card in his hand, reading it over and over again as if the words might change if he looked at them enough times. Margaret snatched the card from his hands, irritated by his strange behavior. "What is this nonsense?" But as she read the card, her own face began to change. The blood drained from her cheeks. Her mouth fell open. Her hand started to shake. This can't be real," she whispered. Charles finally found his voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. She's the Richardson. Our merger. The woman we've been negotiating with for months." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The room began to fall silent as the news spread from person to person. The laughter died away. The phone stopped recording. People began to understand that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. Simone looked around at all the faces that had been laughing at her just moments before, faces that were now frozen in horror and disbelief. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying easily across the now silent room. "The merger that was going to save your bankrupt company. The merger that was going to inject $1.2 billion into Whitmore Industries and keep you from losing everything your family has built over the past century." She paused, letting that sink in. That Richardson. The silence in the room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Every single person in that penthouse suddenly understood that they had just witnessed the most expensive mistake in business history. Margaret's champagne glass joined her husband's on the floor, shattering into pieces. Sophia stopped posing for photos, her face frozen in shock. Brandon lowered his phone, the cruel video suddenly feeling like evidence of his own destruction. Charles tried to speak, but no words came out. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air, but his brain couldn't process what had just happened. Because in that moment, every single person in that room realized the same horrifying truth. They had just humiliated, degraded, and racially abused the one woman who held their entire future in her hands. And she had just decided to destroy them all. If you were in Simone's shoes, what would you do to the family? Would you cancel the merger or forgive them? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories like this. What followed was the complete and utter collapse of everything the Whitmore family had ever built. And it all happened in real time, in front of everyone who had been complicit in their cruelty. Margaret Whitmore, still clinging to her delusions of superiority, even as her world crumbled around her, was the first to break the deafening silence. Her voice cracked with desperation as she pointed an accusatory finger at Simone, as if she could somehow make reality disappear through sheer force of denial. "This is impossible. You're nobody. This has to be some kind of sick joke. There's no way someone like you could be worth billions." Her words echoed through the silent penthouse like the last gasps of a dying empire. But Simone Richardson was done being patient. She was done being polite. She was done pretending that the systematic cruelty and racial humiliation she had endured was acceptable in any civilized society. She pulled out her phone with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation and dialed a number that would change everything. Her voice carried across the room with crystal clarity, each word landing like a nail in the Whitmore family's coffin. "Patricia? It's Simone. Execute the Whitmore cancellations. All of them. Right now." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and efficient. The voice of someone accustomed to handling billion-dollar decisions. "Understood, Miss Richardson. Should I also cancel the real estate leases, the technology partnerships, and the charity sponsorships?" "Everything," Simone replied, never taking her eyes off the faces of the people who had spent the evening humiliating her. "I want every contract, every deal, every partnership completely severed. Make sure there's nothing left connecting Richardson Global to the Whitmore name." She ended the call and turned to address the room full of people who were now staring at her in complete shock, their faces frozen in expressions of dawning horror. "Since you've all been so curious about who I am," she said, her voice perfectly calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute power, "let me introduce myself properly. I'm worth $57 billion. The number hit the room like a physical blow. People gasped audibly. Some actually took steps backward, as if the words themselves were dangerous. A few of the guests who had been recording her humiliation earlier quickly deleted their videos, suddenly understanding that they had documented their own social suicide. "I own this building that you're standing in right now," Simone continued, looking around the penthouse that she had purchased through one of her shell companies 3 years earlier. "I own half the buildings where you work. I own the companies that employ your husbands, the banks that hold your mortgages, and the investment funds that manage your retirement accounts." She paused, letting the full scope of her power sink into their consciousness. "Some of you work for me and don't even know it. Others depend on my companies for your livelihoods. And all of you just participated in racially humiliating your own economic future." Charles Whitmore finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate, broken whisper. "Please, Miss Richardson, we didn't know who you were. If we had known your position, your importance." Simone cut him off with a look that could have frozen molten steel. "You knew I was human, Charles. That should have been enough." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, because everyone in that room understood exactly what she meant. They didn't need to know her net worth to treat her with basic human dignity. They didn't need to know her corporate title to refrain from calling her wretched and worthless. They didn't need to see her bank statements to avoid racially profiling her at the door. They had chosen cruelty over kindness based purely on the color of her skin. And now they were about to pay a price that would echo through generations. Within minutes, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted dramatically as Simone's legal team began arriving. It was like watching a military operation unfold in real time. Lawyers in expensive suits walked through the door carrying briefcases full of documents, their faces stern and professional. They spread out across the room with the efficiency of people who had done this before, pulling out contracts, legal notices, and cancellation orders. The lead attorney, a distinguished African-American woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes like steel, began reading from a prepared statement in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "By order of Richardson Global Industries, the following contracts and agreements are hereby canceled, effective immediately. She paused, consulting her documents. The Whitmore Industries merger, valued at $1.2 billion. The Manhattan real estate lease agreements for all Whitmore office buildings. The technology partnership deals worth $400 million annually. The supply chain contracts valued at $600 million. All charity sponsorships and social partnerships. With each cancellation, Charles Whitmore looked more and more like a man watching his own execution. His hands shook uncontrollably. His breathing became labored and shallow. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost of his former self. But the attorney wasn't finished. Additionally, Richardson Global Industries is calling in all outstanding loans to Whitmore Industries, demanding immediate payment in full. All lines of credit are hereby frozen. All business relationships with Richardson subsidiary companies are terminated. The sound of Charles's champagne glass hitting the marble floor was like a gunshot in the silence. He swayed on his feet, and for a moment it looked like he might collapse entirely. Other guests began to understand that they weren't just witnessing a business disagreement, they were watching a complete financial annihilation unfold in real time. And more importantly, they realized they had been complicit in causing it. The panic started slowly, then spread like wildfire. Mrs. Henderson, who had been laughing loudest at Simone's humiliation, suddenly remembered that her husband's construction company did significant business with Richardson subsidiaries. She quietly slipped toward the exit, hoping to escape before anyone connected her to the evening's events. Mr. Patterson, whose investment firm managed money for several Richardson companies, began frantically texting his partners, trying to figure out if their business relationship would survive his presence at this disaster. The major donors who had been encouraging the Whitmore family's cruelty suddenly developed convenient amnesia about ever knowing them. Business partners who had been planning to announce new deals quietly backed toward the exits. Social allies who had been posing for photos with the family suddenly couldn't remember their names. One by one, the penthouse began to empty as people fled the scene of the disaster they had helped create. It was like watching rats abandon a sinking ship, except these rats were wearing designer gowns and $1,000 suits. But some of the damage was already done. Several guests had been live streaming parts of the party on social media. Videos of Simone's humiliation had already been posted, shared, and viewed thousands of times. But now those same videos were becoming evidence of the most expensive mistake in business history. The hashtags were already trending. Whitmore disaster, billion-dollar mistake, racism costs billions. Sophia Whitmore, who had orchestrated Simone's fall and dumped wine on her dress with such cruel glee, was now sobbing hysterically in the corner of the room. "Daddy, what's happening to us?" she cried, tugging on Charles's sleeve like a lost child. "Why is everyone leaving? Why are people taking pictures of us leaving? What does this mean for our family?" Charles looked down at his daughter, his precious princess who had never faced real consequences for anything in her privileged life, with eyes full of absolute despair. "We're finished, sweetheart," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That merger was our lifeline. Without it, we lose everything. The company, the houses, the lifestyle, all of it." The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. She had never imagined that her cruelty could have real consequences. In her privileged bubble, she had always been protected from the results of her actions by her family's money and social position. "But we're rich," she protested, as if saying the words could somehow make them true. "We're the Whitmores. We've been important for generations. This can't happen to us." But it was happening. In real time. In front of everyone. And it was happening because of choices they had made, words they had spoken, and cruelty they had chosen to inflict on someone they thought was powerless. Brandon, who had been recording Simone's humiliation for his social media, was now frantically trying to delete the videos, but it was too late. Screenshots were already circulating. His cruel laughter was already being shared across platforms with captions like, "Racist trust fund baby destroys his own family's fortune." Margaret Whitmore, who had been standing in stunned silence as her world collapsed around her, suddenly snapped back to life. She rushed toward Simone with desperate energy, her carefully styled hair now disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You can't destroy our entire family over a misunderstanding," she shrieked, her voice rising to nearly hysterical levels. "One bad evening can't erase everything we've built over generations. We made a mistake, but this punishment doesn't fit the crime." Simone looked at her with the kind of calm that comes from absolute moral certainty. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Margaret. This was your character." She began listing the things that had been said to her that evening, each word delivered like a hammer blow to Margaret's crumbling defenses. "You called me wretched. You said I was nothing. You told me I didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. You denied me food and water. You made me stand in a corner like a punished child while your guests mocked me. You denied me basic human dignity, based on nothing more than the color of my skin." Margaret tried to interrupt, to make excuses, to somehow minimize what had happened, but Simone continued relentlessly. "You didn't just insult me, Margaret. You showed me exactly who you are when you thought I had no power to affect your life. You revealed your true character when you believed there would be no consequences for your cruelty." She paused, letting that sink in. "Well, now you know who I am, and now there are consequences." Brandon Whitmore, still drunk and somehow still completely missing the gravity of the situation, chose that moment to make everything infinitely worse. With the kind of spectacular stupidity that only comes from a lifetime of never facing real consequences, he stumbled forward and pointed an accusatory finger at Simone. "This is reverse racism," he shouted, swaying slightly as he waved his champagne glass in the air. "You're discriminating against us because we're white. This is illegal. We're going to sue you for everything you're worth." The room went silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of people watching someone dig their own grave with their bare hands. Even his own family looked at him with horror, realizing he had just made their situation exponentially worse. Simone turned to look at Brandon with an expression of almost amused disbelief, as if she were watching a particularly foolish child throw a tantrum. "This isn't racism, Brandon. This is consequences. Learn the difference." She pulled out her phone one more time and made another call that would seal the Whitmore family's fate. "James, I want that entire $1.2 billion redirected to our minority business partnership fund. Every single penny of it. I want it used to fund Black-owned businesses, Latino entrepreneurs, Asian American startups, and Native American enterprises." Brandon's face went from red to white in the span of seconds as he finally began to understand what he had done. "And James," Simone continued, "I want a press release sent out within the hour, explaining exactly why we're redirecting these funds. I want the world to know that Richardson Global Industries stands against racism in all its forms, even when it costs us potential profits." Charles Whitmore finally understood that begging was his only option. The proud patriarch who had inherited an empire and was about to lose it all in a single evening fell to his knees on the marble floor. "Please, Miss Richardson," he pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. "My children, my wife, they'll have nothing. Everything we've worked for, everything my family has built for 5 generations, it'll all be gone. They don't understand what they've done." Simone looked down at this man who had called her a walking disaster, who had ordered security to remove her like she was trash, and felt no sympathy whatsoever. "They understood perfectly, Charles. They understood that they thought they were better than me. They understood that they could humiliate me without consequences. They understood that my dignity meant nothing to them." She paused, her voice growing colder. "They'll have exactly what they gave me tonight. Nothing." Margaret collapsed into a chair, the fight finally going out of her as the full scope of their destruction became clear. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "We're destroyed. Completely destroyed. Generations of wealth, gone in one night." The remaining guests were now openly staring, some recording this final collapse of a once powerful family. Social media was exploding with updates, hashtags, and commentary. The Whitmore name was becoming synonymous with the most expensive act of racism in corporate history. Simone gathered her wine-stained dress and her purse, preparing to leave the penthouse she owned, but not before delivering her final judgment on the family that had thought they were better than her. "No, Margaret, you're not destroyed. You're just no longer standing on my back to reach success." She walked toward the door with the same dignity she had maintained throughout the evening's humiliation, but paused at the threshold to deliver her final words. "Some people price themselves out of prosperity. Consider this your receipt." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. They just watched as Simone Richardson walked out of their lives, taking with her not just their fortune, but their future. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and very public. Within 24 hours, the story had exploded across every news platform in the world. Billionaire CEO cancels $1.2 billion deal after racial humiliation at elite party. The most expensive act of racism in business history, how one family's cruelty cost them everything. The videos from the party, which the guests had originally posted to mock Simone, became evidence of their own destruction. The hashtag Whitmore racism trended globally for weeks. Business schools began teaching case studies about the incident. Diversity and inclusion experts used it as the ultimate example of why character matters in business. 1 year later, the transformation was complete and devastating. The Whitmore estate auction made international headlines. Historic Manhattan penthouse sold to pay racist families' debts. The Fifth Avenue penthouse that had hosted their final party was sold for $80 million, ironically, to a consortium of minority-owned real estate companies that Simone had recommended to the auction house. The family's art collection, accumulated over generations, was dispersed to museums and private collectors. Their vintage car collection was sold piece by piece. Margaret's jewelry, which she had worn like armor to demonstrate her superiority, was auctioned off to fund a scholarship program for students from underprivileged backgrounds. Charles Whitmore, once the head of a multi-billion-dollar empire, was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. At 63 years old, he took a job as a middle manager at a small real estate firm in Queens, commuting by subway for the first time in his adult life. His new salary was less than what he used to spend on wine in a month. Margaret, who had once ruled Manhattan's social scene with an iron fist, found herself completely ostracized from every circle she had once dominated. Charity boards asked her to resign. Country clubs revoked her membership. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. She was forced to move to a small apartment in New Jersey, where she worked part-time at a department store, the first job she had ever held in her 59 years of life. Sophia had to get her first real job at 27, working as a receptionist at a law firm and learning what it felt like to depend on someone else for a paycheck. Her social media following, once filled with admiring fans, was now dominated by people reminding her of her cruelty. Dating became impossible when every potential partner could Google her name and find videos of her dumping wine on a woman for sport. Brandon faced the harshest consequences of all. His reverse racism rant had been recorded and shared millions of times. No company would hire him. No business school would accept him. His trust fund was gone, seized to pay family debts. At 29, he was living in a studio apartment in Newark, working at a fast casual restaurant, and learning that his college friends disappeared the moment he couldn't pay for their drinks anymore. The family that had once owned half of Manhattan was now scattered, broke, and completely powerless. The Whitmore family had learned the hardest lesson of all: that cruelty is the world's most expensive luxury. They had traded their entire empire for a few moments of feeling superior to someone they thought was beneath them. And in the end, they discovered that when you judge someone by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character, you might just price yourself out of your future. The woman they had called Nothing had shown them exactly what nothing really looked like. And they would spend the rest of their lives remembering the night they chose hatred over humanity and lost everything because of it. Justice, it turned out, was worth exactly $1.2 billion. And Simone Richardson had been happy to pay that price to teach the world that every human being deserves respect, regardless of their race, their background, or their bank account. The Whitmore name, once synonymous with success and power, was now a cautionary tale told in business schools and diversity training sessions around the world. A reminder that in the 21st century, character matters more than capital, and humanity is always more valuable than hatred. Some lessons are expensive. This one cost a family everything they had ever built. But it taught the world something priceless. That respect is not a luxury. It's a necessity. And those who fail to understand that difference do so at their own peril. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.